Across the globe, justice systems are being reimagined through trauma-informed care, desistance theory, and neuroscience. At the forefront of this movement stands a voice for change, a trainer of professionals, and a storyteller committed to evidence-based reform. This is The Criminologist, the podcast exploring the people, the practices, and the possibilities shaping a more humane justice system. And now, please welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidson.
Hello and welcome to episode 230 of The Criminologist podcast, where we explore the intersection of evidence-based practices, lived experience, and the evolving landscape of criminal justice. I'm your host, Joseph Arvidson, and today's guest is someone who brings a deeply human, often overlooked perspective to the conversation. Dr. Charlie Barnao, sociologist, ethnographer, and professor at the University of Palermo in Italy. Charlie has spent his career studying those pushed to the margins of society. But more than that, he's lived among them. For 15 years, he chose to reside in a halfway house, not as a practitioner or academic observer, but as a member of the community. That lived immersion offers a rare and powerful lens into what he calls the sociology of survival. In this episode, we dig deep into what resilience looks like when survival, not success, is the daily goal. We talk about the importance of understanding social context, how identity is shaped by both stigma and opportunity, and how qualitative research, stories, not just stats, can transform the way we supervise and support justice-involved individuals. We also touch on the language we use, how labels shape lives, and why believing in our clients isn't just hopeful, it's essential. So whether you're a probation officer, trainer, policymaker, or student of desistance, this one's for you. So, let's get into it. Enjoy my conversation with Dr. Charlie Barnao, and I'll see you all on the other side. Well, welcome to the show, Charlie, joining us all the way today from Italy. Charlie, why don't we start out with you introducing yourself to the Criminologist listeners? Tell us a little bit about your journey, your past, your pathway that led you to where you are today and the great work that you're doing that we're going to cover during today's interview.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. My name is Charlie Barnao. I'm a sociologist. In particular, I'm an ethnographer. I have a PhD in sociology at the University of Trento in the north of Italy, but I am from Palermo, Sicily. And for a quarter, I am from a small island in the Mediterranean Sea. That name is the name is Stromboli Island. As I told you before, I'm an ethnographer, and I'm studying mainly urban marginalities, extreme poverty. Even if in the last years, in the last 10 years, I'm studying also total institutions like prisons and barracks, the army. I'm studying war. And actually, I decided to study sociology after a very interesting year serving my country in the army, in the paratroopers, in the military paratroopers. And now I am a full professor of sociology of culture at the University of Palermo.
So let's unpack some of your work you're doing, Charlie. I know, as you've alluded to, you've spent a lot of time getting to know people who sort of live on the edges of society, folks who are often ignored or misunderstood. Charlie, can you tell us about your approach to the kind of research that you do, which I find fascinating, and really what you've learned about how people survive when the odds are stacked against them?
Well, I think that I can say that everything started from studying sociology and at the same time living as a resident volunteer for about 15 years in a halfway house in Trento. So while I was studying sociology, I was doing my PhD. At the same time, I was living in this halfway house and living together in the same place with people who had come from very hard experiences of strict life, prostitution, particularly difficult migration routes, people coming from wars, prison. And at the same time I was studying Max Weber's Understanding Sociology. All these things led me to, I think in a natural way, to be more and more interested in extreme urban marginality like homelessness, prostitution, prison, and to use ethnographic research tools. In particular, I'm an ethnographer. I use qualitative research tools for understanding those phenomena. By studying these phenomena, on the one hand, I refined the methodological instrumentation, realizing that how can I say, a non-judgmental and relativist in a cultural sense approach is essential if you want to understand someone. If you really want to understand the meaning that the social actor gives to his or her action, you have to help him or her express himself or herself as freely as possible in order to communicate it to you. From this point of view, I found a great benefit in using, as I said before, the qualitative methodology of social research combined with the principles of the psychological approach of Carl Rogers, one of the founders of humanistic psychology, known especially for his person-centered psychotherapy. On the other hand, by studying the action strategies of people living on the margins in extreme living conditions, I found that I suffered, like much of the scientific literature, from a major bias. Marginal people, the extreme poor, the homeless, are not people in a state of disarray, but are strategic actors capable of extremely refined survival strategies. Of course, I do not mean to neglect the structural causes of social phenomena, such as extreme poverty, like homelessness, prostitution, etc. I mean to say that in the vast majority of cases, the causes of the homelessness, of prostitution, etc., are certainly structural causes, but that once an individual, for example, ends up on the street due to structural causes like the difficulty of finding low-cost rental housing, or due to migration flows resulting from extreme poverty related to war or pandemics, the social actor is not passive, but is capable of refined strategies and an extraordinary survival skill.
I want to pump the brakes just a little bit, Charlie. I'm so fascinated by this interview already. You've used that term a couple of times, that you're a ethnographer, and then you talked about really striking that balance between the qualitative research and the quantitative. I come from the sort of old school empirical data from what we call our risk needs responsivity framework. But my point is, the good news is that our profession here in America, at least the correctional profession, we seem to have a really good stranglehold on the quantitative research, but not so much the qualitative. So maybe just kind of talk about that and explain to the listener when you talk about your approach as an ethnographer, really, getting those stories down and those perceptions to get at that bias. Maybe just give us a little bit of insight about what that approach looks like versus, as I said, the traditional, strictly quantitative research.
Well, there are many differences, and somehow there are opposite ways of seeing the world. First of all, in the qualitative approach, the involvement of the researcher is necessary. While in the quantitative approach, you have to, as much as you can, not be involved in the object of your research. In the qualitative research, you have to be as much as possible close to the actor that you are trying to understand. So while in the qualitative approach, you try to understand in a comprehensive way, in a Weber sense, the meaning of the action, in a quantitative approach, you try to explain the causes of for example, a phenomenon. Another great difference is all the design of the research design. The quantitative approach looks for a deductive approach. You start from general propositions, like general hypotheses, that you operatize them inside a questionnaire that you submit to a group of people to falsificate in a Popperian sense to validate the original hypothesis. So you go from the general hypothesis to the particular, and then at the end of the research, you understand if the first hypothesis, the hypothesis from where you start, were correct or not. In the qualitative approach, the approach is the opposite. You start from the observation. You don't know exactly where you're going. And you start from the observation, and little by little, you arrive through generalization at the end to formalize some general proposition that are very similar with the hypothesis of the quantitative approach. So someone says that the qualitative approach and when the quantitative start, and vice versa.
Yeah, I love it. I imagine too, Charlie, well, regular listeners of the Criminologist podcast are aware that I love interviewing individuals with lived experience in the justice system. And I'm now realizing what I've really been doing is sort of promoting more of this qualitative approach to understanding really the landscape that we're working with here, and hitting it from both sides, like you said, the qualitative and the quantitative. You talk about something called the Sociology of Survival. This really caught my attention, Charlie. For those of us working in corrections or social work, so what should we understand about how people adapt to survive? The reason I say this really got my attention, I've co-developed with my colleague Nicole Kimberly Staley a supervision model that we refer to as TIDES, which is short for trauma-informed assistance. But it's really all about reframing, among other things, how we view, for example, quote unquote, criminal behaviors or deviant behaviors or delinquent behaviors. And my colleague and I are always saying to the practitioner, you need to reframe your lens and think of these as survival behaviors. So that's why I said I was fascinated when I saw your work around the sociology of survival. Talk about that, and just, this notion of, if we better understand how people adapt to survive, we're better positioned to help connect with them and help them.
Thank you very much for this question and for your interest in survival strategies. Well, some questions I asked myself as I observed and studied the survival strategies of people in extreme living conditions. And these questions are, for example, what do we mean by survival? Can we speak of a sociology of survival? In what way is possible to demarcate its boundaries? Can it be useful for the purpose of field research, in particular ethnographic research? Well, the topic of survival in extreme life context has had, especially since the end of the World War II, increasing attention, both from popular culture and from the scientific community. With regard to the popular culture, a huge amount of cultural products like fiction, TV, dramas, films, documentaries, comics, books, etc., have been produced that have focused on the stories of protagonists acting and surviving in prohibitive environments within extreme, often apocalyptic, post-war, post-pandemic scenarios, in which the individual faced and continues struggle to manage to stay alive. For example, the survivalism movement and the cultural strengths proposed by its participants probably constitute the clearest and most well-defined moment of formalization of popular interest in survival. The military and the army is also, as one of, we can easily guess, deeply connected with the theme of survival in war, in combat, etc. About the social science community, although not always systematically, it has often shown attention to the issue of survival. It has done from a variety of perspectives and with the most diverse approach. For example, from Bettelheim's classic work on survival in the Nazi death camps, to more recent work in psychology of emergency, from studies in the sociology of disasters to sociological studies that focus on the use of concept of resistance, often the use of this term in a predominantly political connotation. Perhaps with this in mind, I start by considering the context in which survival occurs. Those on survival are always the studies of human behavior under extreme living conditions from a psychological and or material point of view. The latter meaning a situation that is or represent the ultimate end in a local or temporal sense of something. On this basis, extreme life is not only the life of those who face the consequences of occasional, exceptional, and particularly traumatic events like wars or pandemics, but it is also the life of those who live in particularly risky and indeed extreme quotation quotes for the physical and psychological health of the individual, although everyday and non-exceptional context. For example, one thinks for the life of a long-term homeless person, 10 or perhaps 15 years of living on the street, or that of a person sentenced to life imprisonment. These are undoubtedly extreme situations, but not necessarily extraordinary for those who experience them, often falling with the normality and dailiness of the social actors who experience them and towards which they are relatively stably adapted. So what I've done is once I have delimited the context, I try to use the more classical tools of sociology to attempt to delimit the object. So based on a typical sociological approach, we can say with Max Weber, if sociology has social action as its object, we can define the sociology of survival as that which has as its object social actions under extreme conditions of life. It thus becomes central to the interpretation and analysis of the social actions. We observe the meaning that actors give to their actions as actions for survival. The extreme life of the social actor involved in such contexts thus becomes characterized by continuous choice between actions that may allow survival and actions, on the other hand, that may result in serious harm, psychological or physical or death. And after all this, I'm pleased to mention that for a few years now, I've been teaching this course, a course of Sociology of Survival within the undergraduate course in sociology. And also I'm teaching it in prison, in maximum security, in a maximum security prison, where I found many professors of survival strategies, of course. Many of my students are really professors of this subject.
Yeah, I love that. I love that comparison. Continue, please. This is so fascinating to me, Charlie. We are kindred spirits in so many ways. I just love, for example, how you've leveraged the use of media to really, I would say, normalize the population that you're speaking of. A lot of the work I do is trying to get at the bias and the misperceptions people have, whether they're justice impacted individuals, and seeing them in that light of, well, maybe they're survivors of traumatic experiences, for example. But I'm always trying to get at this us versus them mentality that so many professionals bring to the table. And as I said, the more we can normalize this and get around that bias, we'll get past that and get so much better results. I would love to get a copy of the syllabus for that undergraduate course. But talk more about the work you've done in prisons. I often say when I interview individuals with lived experience, well, you're the real subject matter experts, not me with all my books and study and whatnot. But what's that been like working in the prison, like you said, meeting those real professors of survival?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, in fact, the contact point between us and them is the humanity. And we can ask a question about if all these notions could be useful, for example, for those of us that are working in corrections or social services. Well, I say that social actors develop under extreme conditions extraordinary qualities of survival. Recognizing and studying these extraordinary capabilities, first humanize social actors, especially when they are highly stigmatized and dehumanized by public discourse, as in the case of homeless people, prisoners, criminals, prostitutes, foreign immigrants, etc. Then this approach provides us with extraordinary resources for problem solving, especially when our goal is to solve social problems. Let me give you an example coming from prison, exactly from a student of mine, the case of Sergio Ferraro. This is his name, and the importance of a non-judgmental approach in relating to each other. Sergio Ferraro is one of the 3 students detained in a high-security prison who graduate with me. I was their supervisor in sociology in the last years. These 3 students detained for are detained for very serious mafia crimes. In addition to the other crimes related to mafia organizations, they were part of, all 3 were convicted of murder. Salvatore Curatolo is detained for Sicilian mafia crimes. Sergio Ferraro, the one I'm going to say something, formerly affiliated with the Casalesi, Gomorra, Campania Mafia. And the third one is Catello Romano, a Camorra Campania Mafia killer. All they graduated in sociology with autoethnographic thesis. The 3 theses, which in fact represent the first scientific products of social laboratory they had in prison with them. The 3 theses were published already. 2 already published, 1 is going to be published. The three students used an auto-ethnographic approach, and they used ethnography and sociology, generally speaking, to analyze in particular themes from their own experience and biographical journey related to family life, criminal activity, and prison life. The so-called unconditional acceptance of the other in this way becomes very important to help these students to express themselves in the best way and to understand their culture profoundly. After all this process of sociological or ethnographic analysis of his life, Sergio Ferraro from Casalesi spoke to me about this process, and he said to me, being able to tell myself without judgment about the horrible things I have done has been crucial for me. I realized that I'm not all wrong. I had qualities, characteristics of my personality that I was using in my criminal life that are mine. I was just using them from wrong purposes. His nickname while he was in criminal gangs was Sergiolino, Little Sergio. Sergiolino was good at organizing the group, handling emergency situations. He was quick with decisions. He was a leader. Today, those qualities are the same ones that make me become a university tutor to help other detained students, that make me become a leader and organize prayer groups in prison.
I interviewed an individual from Norway a few episodes ago, Charlie, by the name of Armand Vestad, but he told a very similar story about how he was at one point one of Norway's most notorious criminals, involved in a lot of nefarious activities from gun running and drugs. But to your point, when he was incarcerated, he met with a practitioner who had him sort of go through, like you did with that individual, that same type of reflective, exploratory process. And they were able to tease out those same traits that made him, that allowed him rather to excel in his underworld criminal gang life, could also be used in a pro-social fashion. And now he's been released from prison. He's doing amazing work now with helping justice-impacted individuals connect with financial resources and that type of thing. But he's basically using that same acumen, those same abilities, but slightly altered in a pro-social fashion. So I really applaud your efforts there, and I think that's really something we need to work more with, rather. Charlie, many of my listeners work with clients who, of course, are trying to turn their lives around, whether it's on probation, parole, just coming out of prison. I often speak of desistance theory on this program, and we know that if you change the story, you can change an individual's pathway. From what you've seen, Charlie, how do people begin to tell a new story about themselves? And then also, what might get in the way sometimes?
Yeah, about that, I can tell you the case of Camorra hitman, Catello Romano, the other student I mentioned before, detained in a maximum security prison. Catello Romano, he does not speak and confess his criminal acts under the, we can call it torture of 41 bis, that is the harshest solitary confinement prison device we have in Italy, and probably one of the harshest in the world, to which he has been subjected for over 6 years. So he didn't speak there, he didn't say anything there, but he speaks and confesses when he is maybe for the first time during his long imprisonment in a context where he feels understood and respected. If he is listened to deeply, if he feels respected, he decides to change his story. The title of his dissertation is Autoethnography of a Criminal Career. Romano's dissertation deals with his criminal career in the mafia organization up to the time of his arrest. Catello Romano is now 33 years old and has been held continuously since he was 19. Originally from Castellammare, close to Naples. Romano belongs to a humble family with no ties to the local criminal networks. He was a schoolboy, a good schoolboy, and a young up-and-comer in the martial arts. He became fascinated with a number of criminal figures during his adolescence. This is what he writes in his dissertation. Catello's two main masters in his criminal career from his teenage years are Raffaele Cutolo, a mafia boss, very famous in his film portrayal in the famous movie Il Camorrista, made by Giuseppe Tornatore, and the other master of Catello was a local mobster he met while frequenting the town bar where he lived with his family. Romano then decides to pursue a criminal career. His goal is to emulate his masters and to have, through criminal activity, the respect and social success that his masters had. He thus approaches organized crime beginning to commit his first minor offenses, threats, intimidation, violent extortion actions, until after a short time, he goes on to commit very serious crimes, including several contract killings, for which he will be arrested and sentenced to 30 years in prison. In his dense and intense criminal ethnography, Romano even goes so far as to describe and analyze in detail, among others, 3 murders for which he had never been prosecuted before. This aspect in particular will make his thesis a case with great media impact. Media impact indeed. The news of his confession through the pages of autoethnography will have a great echo and will be taken up by numerous national and international newspapers, El País, and also many newspapers and magazines in the States. Romano chooses to confess through his thesis to 3 murders for which, as we said before, he had yet to be officially prosecuted. Now, I can say after this confession, first of all, we say that a few weeks after the degradation, Catello Romano was transferred for security reasons to another maximum security prison in northeastern Italy. And a few days ago, for those murders that he confessed in his dissertation, Catello Romano was sentenced to life in prison.
That's fascinating, Charlie. That is absolutely fascinating. I am so looking forward to keeping up with your work, Charlie. Like I said, we're kindred spirits on so many levels, up to and including the fact I've also been blessed to have been able to travel internationally. And one thing that I've realized is that the more you travel, the more you actually meet people face to face versus what you see on television or in the movies or on a YouTube video clip. Meeting them face to face, you see that we're more common than we have more in common than not. Charlie, you've studied communities both in Italy and the United States. What's something that you've noticed about how people experience exclusion or injustice that, again, really crosses borders? And I guess the question is, are there patterns that seem to show up everywhere that you've noticed, Charlie?
Well, we can say that survival is a survival in all parts of the world, and there are common patterns of actions. I give you an example between the two parts of the world that I can consider more distant between each other, Italy and Colombia, for example. For example, I found the common traits in the survival strategies of homeless people surviving in Italy and homeless people surviving in Colombia. Done this ethnography of survival strategies a few years ago, and I conducted it for a few years. Italy and Colombia are two very different, as we can imagine, somewhat opposite realities. There are differences, historical differences, geographical, economic, between the two countries. Just to say that Italy is one of the most developed countries in the world, one of the safest, with an estimated number of, it's very difficult to count homeless people all over the world, but we can say that there are maybe around 50,000 homeless people in Italy for 60 million inhabitants. On the other hand, in Colombia, it's a developing country, among the most one of the most violent and dangerous countries in the world, with an estimated 3 million homeless people for 47 million inhabitants. And inside these two very different countries, I studied two more different series, because even more pronounced is the difference between the places where the data of my ethnography were collected. Because one city was Trento in Italy, and the other city was two cities, Bogotá and Cali in Colombia. Trento is a small city, like it's about 100,000 inhabitants in wealthy northeastern Italy. It is one of the safest and wealthiest cities in Italy, with an estimated number of homeless of 230 people on the street. Bogotá and Cali are the first and the third largest cities in Colombia, respectively, and they are considered among the poorest and the most violent cities in the world.
Yeah.
So, despite the enormous environmental and social differences between the places considered, some common behavioral patterns emerge with reference to the daily survival of the homeless. The presence of similar behavioral patterns becomes all the more relevant, the greater the difference between the places, of course, where the research was conducted. My research examines the survival strategies of homeless people, in particular street homeless people. And the findings of my ethnography highlight the main features of the homeless street survival activities, the so-called shadow works. The shadow works, I remember who formalized this concept, among the others, was David Snow, the great David Snow in the States, Professor Snow. His famous book, Down on Their Luck. The shadow works are characterized by exchange relations mostly unbalanced, occurring in different forms, from those close to the, in anthropology called generalized reciprocity, to those of clear negative reciprocity. These works are shadow in this sense. They belong to the sphere of the informal economy, and in addition, they often reproduce jobs or activities of normal society in a form adapted to street life. So, in all street of the world, in all the street of the world, among those living their own situation of marginality, you find, for example, an information office, a reception service, a luggage room, a lookout service, a theater. Those are all informal services that are carried out by the street homeless in the incessant and sophisticated relations of exchange of material and immaterial goods essential for survival on the street. Obviously, the same services will be carried out differently in different places, like in Italy and Colombia, because they are adapted to the local social, cultural, and economic context. The information service in Trento, a small and wealthy and quiet Italian city, of course, will be different from the information service carried out in Bogotá, a large and violent Colombian city. But both services will have a common matrix and similar characteristics. And of course, as we already said before, the findings of this research show that unlike the view that perceives the homeless are marginalized, disorganized, the homeless people are capable of enacting selective strategies of adaptation to street survival within a specific normative framework.
Reminds me of a book I read years ago, Charlie, which, of course, the title escapes me, but it was essentially sort of an expose on some of the more notorious public housing complexes in the city of Chicago. And the book was written decades ago when the Gangster Disciples street gang, sort of like our domestic mafia, if you will, were running those housing complexes to the degree that local law enforcement would not even attempt to patrol these areas. But I bring this up, Charlie, because as you were just alluding to, one of the aspects of the book talked about how within all this chaos and hopelessness, organically, these sort of services popped up, whether it was, I need an electrician or a plumber, or I need someone to get this for me or that, in a almost sort of barter system economy arose from these islands, if you will, of exclusion that we set aside. But as you discovered as well, whether it was in Italy or Colombia, these survival economies kind of popped up organically.
Yes, there are two different societies. And in both of them, there are services that they are necessary to survive. So there are rules that they are, and there are different, and it's not disorganized. It's very well organized.
Charlie, where do you think that individuals such as yourself who are trying to get the word out as far as social justice and issues around authoritarianism, for example, scholars such as yourself need to speak up and get involved in real world issues and not just write about them? In other words, how can other kindred spirits take action and sort of move the needle and not just talk about and write about these issues?
We already mentioned the involvement. I believe that involvement of the researcher is necessary and part of the sociologist's work and for the accomplishment of his profession. Qualitative research in particular is naturally devoted to the so-called public sociology. It's a very famous project, just 2 words about that, proposed by some scholars. I just mentioned Michael Burawoy in particular, that aims at science that is public, mainly in 2 ways, that deals with issues that are of collective interest and that often are neglected by academic studies. And second, is public because uses a language for the dissemination of research results that is popular and therefore understandable to everyone and not only to the academic scholars.
Charlie, a lot of my listeners, not all, but a good portion, have direct client contact, whether they're in corrections, social work, human services. But the common denominator is they're dealing with individuals who are on the edge of society. So for those listeners, if you had a chance to directly speak to them and maybe tell them one thing that they could take away from your work, something that, for example, they get to work on Monday morning. I listened to that great interview with Joe and Charlie, and here's one thing I'm going to do in my day-to-day work to maybe leverage a little bit of your knowledge. What would your advice to those folks be, Charlie?
I don't know if it's a great advice. It's what I say to myself every time I go on the field as an ethnographer, and is try to put yourself in their shoes. Try to understand and not pre-explain. And try to have a non-judgmental approach. that is very important, I think, in order to be able to understand the other person's action. I must not think, what would I do in his place? But I must think, what is the meaning, the significance that he or she gives to his or her action? I cannot try to understand the other person unless I personally involve myself in his story, his life, his culture, and therefore unless I am also ready to be contaminated by him. There is no understanding without involvement. This will enable me, as an ethnographer, to better understand his human side, and above all, to discover and then enhance his personal resources, which are indispensable in any helping relationship and in any real deep goal of social change.
I could not agree more. One of the things that I often tell professionals whom I'm training in an effort to get them, as you just said, to maybe adjust the lens of how they view those they supervise, is that the question needs to be reframed from the traditional one of what's wrong with you to a different question of what happened to you. Let's get at that root cause. Let's get at some perspective taking and really take a deep dive on that person's journey. Charlie Barnao, I cannot wait to hear more about your great work, and I look forward to future conversations on the Criminologist podcast. Regular listeners of the show will know, Charlie, that I sign off every episode with my tagline of, always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us. And I think you've really exemplified the spirit of that tagline in the work you do, and getting folks to realize that, as I said, there's no them. We have to get away from this otherism, those guys, those mafia folks, those bad people, and understand that we're all experiencing the same human condition. Charlie Barnao, thank you so much. Until next time, my friend.
Grazie mille. Thank you so much, Joe, and see you soon.
See you soon. That was Dr. Charlie Barnao with a reminder that survival itself can be a profound act of resilience. As we reflect on this conversation, it's clear that the lived experiences of those we supervise are not defined by risk scores or chronological case file notes. They're shaped by survival strategies built in environments we don't always see and sometimes don't fully understand. Charlie's work reinforces a truth we talk about often here. Supervision isn't just about compliance. It's about context. It's about recognizing the invisible barriers, poverty, isolation, stigma, that shape behavior long before we meet our clients. That's why in the TIDES supervision model, we emphasize resiliency as a pillar of change. Because when we shift our lens from asking, why did you fail, to how have you survived, we open up new pathways for growth, dignity, and transformation. It's also why identity and social support are so central. When survival becomes the goal, identity is often wrapped in survival tactics. Our role as practitioners isn't to erase those identities, but to co-create new ones, rooted in hope, belonging, and the possibility of something more. So as you step back into your work, I challenge you, look beyond the behavior, see the survivors behind the struggles, and remember that every story of survival holds the seed of resilience and the possibility of change. Once again, thanks for listening, and always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
The contact point between us and them is the humanity.
The Criminologist podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, training opportunities, program design, or interview requests, visit theparagongroup.llc.com. To learn more about the TIDES supervision model, a trauma-informed, desistance-based approach to community supervision, please visit the TIDESLLC.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to check out the Criminologist YouTube channel for additional content, including exclusive video interviews and international insights. Both the Criminologist podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Don't forget to give the show a 5-star review. And as always, thank you for listening.